The emergency alert pierced through the quiet of the command center at 0347 hours, its red pulse casting shadows across weathered faces bent over monitors. Commander Elena Vasquez stood at the periphery of the crisis room, her silver-streaked hair pulled back in a regulation bun, watching as younger officers scrambled to assess the situation. The cruise ship Meridian Star had lost all power in the North Atlantic, 200 souls adrift in 15-foot swells, with a storm system bearing down fast. Around her, voices rose in controlled urgency, but no one looked her way. She had been relegated to observer status 6 months ago, her decades of maritime rescue experience deemed outdated by a command structure that valued youth over wisdom. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Atlantic Research Station perched on the edge of the Maine coast like a concrete sentinel, its radar towers cutting sharp lines against the pre-dawn sky. Salt spray from the churning ocean below had stained the building's walls with white streaks, and the constant wind carried the scent of seaweed and diesel fuel from the harbor. Inside the operations center, fluorescent lights hummed over banks of communication equipment, their harsh glare reflecting off polished surfaces and the tired faces of personnel who had been called from their beds. Elena stood near the coffee station, her hands wrapped around a ceramic mug that had seen better days. The liquid inside was bitter and strong, fuel for what promised to be a long day. She wore her standard-issue Coast Guard uniform, the fabric pressed and creased with military precision, but the brass on her collar told a different story than the deference she received. 3 decades of service, 12 major rescues, countless lives saved. And yet she found herself pushed to the margins of every briefing, every strategy session, every moment that mattered. Captain Morrison strode into the center, his younger frame cutting through the assembled personnel like a ship through calm water. At 38, he represented the new generation of command, confident in technology and quick to make decisions. His voice carried easily across the room as he called for attention, and Elena watched the way others straightened at his presence, their respect automatic and unquestioned. She remembered when her own entrance had commanded such attention before. The whispers about retirement and the subtle suggestions that perhaps it was time to step aside. The situation brief unfolded with clinical efficiency. The Meridian Star, a luxury cruise vessel carrying 197 passengers and crew, had suffered a catastrophic engine failure during the night. The backup systems had failed in cascade, leaving the ship dead in the water with no power for navigation, communication, or life support. Worse, the weather service had upgraded the approaching storm to a Category 2 system, with winds expected to reach 70 miles per hour within 6 hours. Morrison's finger traced the electronic chart displayed on the main screen, showing the ship's position roughly 80 nautical miles northeast of their station. The seas were already running 12 to 15 feet, he explained, and the storm surge would make any rescue operation exponentially more dangerous as the morning progressed. They had a narrow window of opportunity, perhaps 4 hours before conditions became unsurvivable for both the stranded passengers and any rescue vessels attempting to reach them. Elena listened from her position near the wall, her expression neutral but her mind already working through the complexities of the situation. She had operated in waters like these before, in storms that had tested the limits of both her equipment and her crew. The coordinates Morrison had displayed were familiar to her, a stretch of ocean where the continental shelf created unpredictable currents and the seafloor rose in jagged peaks that could shred a vessel's hull if approached carelessly. The plan Morrison outlined was straightforward and by the book. The station's primary cutter, the Vigilant, would lead the rescue operation with support from 2 smaller patrol boats. They would establish a safe perimeter around the disabled cruise ship and begin evacuating passengers using standard rescue baskets and life rafts. The operation would be coordinated from the Vigilance Command Center, with Morrison taking personal command of the rescue effort. A lieutenant near the navigation station raised his hand, his young face creased with concern. The weather window was tighter than usual, he observed, and the passenger manifest showed a significant number of elderly travelers and families with small children. The standard evacuation procedures could take 8 to 10 hours under ideal conditions, but with the storm approaching, they might have half that time. Morrison nodded grimly and acknowledged the challenge. They would have to move fast and efficiently, he said, relying on their training and equipment to overcome the time constraints. He looked around the room, his gaze passing over Elena without pause, and asked for volunteers from the rescue swimmer teams. Hands went up immediately, young men and women eager to prove themselves in the most dangerous conditions their service could offer. Elena remained silent, her coffee growing cold in her hands. She had seen operations like this before, had led them when the stakes were just as high and the margin for error just as thin. The plan Morrison had outlined was solid but conventional, the kind of approach that worked well in training exercises and moderate weather. What it lacked was the flexibility and experience needed when conditions deteriorated beyond the parameters of the manual. The briefing continued with technical details about equipment loads, communication protocols, and backup contingencies. Elena found herself mentally cataloging the gaps in their preparation, the assumptions built into their strategy that might prove fatal if the situation evolved differently than expected. She had learned through hard experience that the ocean rarely cooperated with even the best-laid plans, and that survival often depended on the ability to adapt faster than conditions could change. As the meeting broke up, personnel scattered to their various preparations. Elena remained at her station, watching the younger officers move with the confident energy of those who had never faced failure. She remembered that feeling, the certainty that training and technology could overcome any challenge the sea might present. Experience had taught her a more nuanced truth, one that came with the weight of decisions made under pressure and the memory of those who had not made it home. Lieutenant Sarah Chun approached her station, tablet in hand and a questioning look on her face. Chun was one of the few younger officers who still sought Elena's input, perhaps because she had grown up hearing stories of the older woman's legendary rescues. She asked quietly if Elena thought the weather window was as tight as Morrison had suggested, or if there might be options he hadn't considered. Elena set down her coffee and looked at the meteorological data displayed on Chun's tablet. The storm system was indeed formidable, a tight spiral of wind and rain that would make any rescue operation hazardous. But she had operated in similar conditions before, and she knew that the ocean's behavior was more complex than the computer model suggested. The key was understanding not just what the weather would do, but how it would interact with the specific geography of the rescue site. She pointed to a small notation on the chart that most of the others had overlooked. The coordinates where the Meridian Star was drifting were near the edge of the Laurentian Channel, a deep underwater canyon that created unique current patterns and wind effects. During storm conditions, she explained, that area could become either a natural shelter or a death trap, depending on the approach vector and timing of the rescue operation. Chun listened intently, her stylus poised over the tablet as she took notes. Elena continued, describing how the channel's depth and orientation could create wind shadows that might provide temporary calm water, but only if the rescue vessels approached from the correct direction. The standard protocols called for positioning rescue ships upwind of the disabled vessel, but in this case, that approach might put them directly in the path of the worst weather. As she spoke, Elena became aware that others in the room had begun to listen. Morrison himself had paused in his preparations, his attention caught by her analysis of the channel's characteristics. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. For a moment, the familiar dynamics of command and expertise reasserted themselves, and Elena felt the old authority in her voice as she described the tactical considerations that could make the difference between success and disaster. But the moment passed quickly. Morrison nodded politely and thanked her for her input, then returned to his preparations with the air of someone who had heard interesting but ultimately irrelevant information. The subtle dismissal was familiar to Elena. The way her experience was acknowledged but not truly valued, treated as historical curiosity rather than practical wisdom. The operations center continued its preparations as the first light of dawn began to filter through the windows. Elena watched the activity with the detached interest of someone who had been relegated to the sidelines, her decades of experience reduced to an advisory role that no one particularly wanted to hear. She had been through this transition before, the gradual erosion of her authority as younger officers took over the missions that had once defined her career. The irony was not lost on her. She had spent 30 years building a reputation as one of the Coast Guard's most capable rescue commanders, earning respect through successful operations in some of the most dangerous waters on Earth. But that same experience had also made her older, and in a service that prized youth and vigor, age had become a liability rather than an asset. The institutional memory she carried was seen as outdated, her hard-won wisdom dismissed as resistance to change. She finished her coffee and began to make her way toward the door, intending to return to her quarters and wait for reports from the rescue operation. But as she reached the threshold, a new voice cut through the ambient noise of the operations center. The communications specialist at the main console had received an update from the Meridian Star, and the news was not good. The disabled cruise ship had begun to drift faster than expected, carried by currents that were pulling it toward the shallower waters near the continental shelf. More critically, the ship's emergency generators had failed completely, leaving the passengers and crew without heat, light, or the ability to operate the ship's pumps. Water had begun to enter the lower decks through stress fractures in the hull, and the ship's list was increasing gradually but steadily. Morrison absorbed this information with the focused intensity of a commander facing a crisis that was evolving faster than his plans could accommodate. He quickly recalculated the timeline, conferring with his navigation team about the new drift patterns and their implications for the rescue operation. The window of opportunity was shrinking, and the margin for error was becoming dangerously thin. Elena paused at the doorway, her hand on the frame as she listened to the updated briefing. The situation was deteriorating in exactly the way her experience had taught her to expect, but faster than the conventional planning had anticipated. She could see the stress beginning to show on Morrison's face as he realized that his carefully constructed operation was already behind schedule before it had even begun. The Vigilant and her escort vessels were still an hour away from launch, their crews working frantically to complete the pre-departure checks and load the specialized equipment needed for the rescue operation. Under normal circumstances, the timeline would have been adequate, but with the cruise ship's condition worsening and the storm approaching ahead of schedule, every minute of delay increased the risk exponentially. Elena made a decision that surprised even her. Instead of leaving the operations center, she walked back toward the main console, her steps measured and deliberate. She approached Morrison with the bearing of someone who had commanded respect in situations exactly like this one, and when she spoke, her voice carried the authority of 3 decades of successful rescues. She offered to take the station's backup cutter, the Resolute, and proceed immediately to the rescue site. The smaller vessel could be ready to depart within 30 minutes, she explained, and its lighter draft and greater maneuverability would allow it to operate in the shallower waters where the cruise ship was drifting. While the Vigilant completed its preparations, she could establish contact with the Meridian Star and begin assessing the situation firsthand. Morrison's initial reaction was polite but firm. The Resolute was not equipped for a rescue operation of this magnitude, he pointed out, and the weather conditions were already at the edge of safe operating parameters. The standard protocols called for the primary rescue vessels to operate as a coordinated unit, not for individual commanders to proceed independently into dangerous waters. Elena had expected this response, but she pressed her case with the patience of someone who had learned to advocate for her positions without losing her temper. The Resolute might not be able to complete the entire rescue operation, she agreed, but it could provide critical intelligence about the actual conditions at the scene. More importantly, it could begin evacuating the most vulnerable passengers while the larger vessels were still en route, potentially saving hours of critical time. As she spoke, Elena became aware that the conversation had drawn the attention of everyone in the operations center. The younger officers watched the exchange with interest, perhaps sensing that they were witnessing a moment of institutional tension that would define how the rescue operation proceeded. Morrison's authority was being challenged, not through insubordination, but through the quiet assertion of experience and capability that he had chosen to sideline. The communications specialist interrupted the discussion with another update from the Meridian Star. The ship's list had increased to 12 degrees, and the captain was reporting that several passengers were showing signs of hypothermia. The ship's medical officer was requesting immediate evacuation for at least 30 individuals, including elderly passengers and families with young children who were most vulnerable to the deteriorating conditions. Morrison absorbed this information with visible frustration. The timeline was compressing faster than his careful planning had anticipated, and the conventional approach was already proving inadequate to the evolving crisis. He looked around the room, his gaze lingering on the faces of his subordinates, and Elena could see him weighing his options with the burden of command that she knew so well. The moment stretched into silence as Morrison considered his decision. Elena remained quiet, understanding that pushing too hard would only reinforce the perception that she was an aging officer clinging to relevance rather than someone offering genuine assistance. The choice had to be his, made from his own assessment of the situation rather than her advocacy. Finally, Morrison nodded with the reluctant acceptance of someone who had run out of better alternatives. He authorized Elena to take the Resolute and proceed to the rescue site with the understanding that her role would be limited to reconnaissance and evacuation of the most critical cases. The Vigilant would follow as soon as possible and assume command of the overall operation, coordinating the full-scale rescue effort. Elena accepted the mission parameters without argument, understanding that Morrison needed to maintain face with his subordinates while still utilizing her capabilities. She had learned long ago that effective command sometimes required accepting less than ideal circumstances in order to achieve essential objectives. The important thing was getting to the Meridian Star before the weather window closed completely. As she prepared to leave the operations center, Elena caught Chan's eye and nodded toward the door. The younger officer understood the silent invitation and followed her into the corridor, where they could speak privately about the operation ahead. Elena had worked with Chun before and trusted her technical skills and judgment under pressure. More importantly, Chun was young enough to be accepted by the crew, but experienced enough to understand the complexities of the rescue they were about to attempt. In the equipment bay, Elena moved with the efficient precision of someone who had prepared for emergency departures countless times before. She pulled her survival suit from its locker, the familiar weight of the waterproof fabric a comfort in the uncertainty of the morning. The suit was worn but well maintained, its patches and repairs a testament to the dangerous conditions she had faced over the years. Shun worked beside her, gathering the additional equipment they would need for the reconnaissance mission. Emergency medical supplies, communication gear, and the specialized tools required for ship-to-ship transfers. In heavy weather, the younger officer's movements were quick and efficient, but Elena could see the tension in her shoulders as she contemplated the conditions they would face. As they completed their preparations, Elena found herself thinking about the crews. Ship passengers who were depending on their success. 197 people, including families and elderly travelers who had expected nothing more dangerous than sea breezes and sunset dinners. They were experiencing the ocean's capacity for sudden violence, the way calm waters could transform into a life-threatening crisis with little warning. The walk to the harbor was short but steep, the path winding down from the operations center to the protected basin where the Coast Guard vessels were moored. The Resolute sat at her berth like a coiled spring, her engines already warming at the hands of the duty crew who had received Elena's request for immediate departure. The cutter was smaller than the Vigilant, but purpose-built for exactly this kind of operation, with the shallow draft and responsive handling needed for close-quarters rescue work. Elena boarded with the familiar feeling of coming home, her hands automatically checking the bridge controls and communication systems that she had operated in conditions ranging from dead calm to hurricane-force winds. The Resolute responded to her touch like a well-trained partner, her engines settling into the steady rhythm that would carry them through the dangerous waters ahead. The harbor entrance was protected by a stone breakwater that had stood against Atlantic storms for over a century, its massive blocks worn smooth by decades of wave action. As the Resolute cleared the harbor mouth, Elena felt the first taste of the heavy seas that awaited them, the cutter's bow rising and falling with the long swells that preceded the approaching storm. The motion was familiar and oddly comforting, a reminder that she belonged on the water rather than behind a desk in the operations center. Chun joined her on the bridge, her face pale but determined as she monitored the weather reports and communications traffic. The storm system was intensifying. As it approached, the wind speed increasing and the wave heights building with each successive update. They had perhaps 3 hours before conditions became too dangerous for rescue operations, and every minute of that time would be precious. As the Resolute settled into her course toward the Meridian Star, Elena felt the weight of command settling on her shoulders once again. The responsibility for the lives of her crew and the success of the mission was hers alone, a burden she had carried many times before, but never with the added complexity of operating outside the normal chain of command. Morrison's authorization had been grudging and conditional, leaving her with limited resources and unclear authority. But Elena had learned long ago that true leadership was not about having perfect conditions or unlimited resources. It was about making the best decisions possible with the information and tools available, and accepting the consequences of those decisions regardless of the outcome. The cruise ship passengers needed help, and she had the skills and experience to provide it. Everything else was just administrative complexity that could be sorted out later. The Resolute cut through the building seas with the steady determination of a vessel designed for exactly this kind of work. Behind them, the Maine coast faded into the morning haze, and ahead lay the vast expanse of the North Atlantic, where 197 souls waited for rescue. Elena gripped the wheel with hands that had guided vessels through storms. That would have broken younger officers, and she began to plan the operation that would either validate her decades of experience or confirm the wisdom of those who had suggested it was time for her to step aside. The ocean stretched ahead of them, gray and restless under the approaching storm, and Elena felt the familiar anticipation that came with heading into dangerous waters on a mission that mattered. This was what she had trained for, what she had lived for, and what she had been denied for too long. The Meridian Star was waiting, and Elena Vasquez was finally going to see again. The first sight of the Meridian Star came through the spray and mist like a vision from a nightmare. The massive cruise ship rolled helplessly in the swells, her elegant lines distorted by the severe list that had developed as water continued to enter her lower decks. What should have been gleaming white superstructure appeared gray and streaked in the stormlight, and Elena could see debris floating around the vessel's hull where lifeboats and deck furniture had been torn loose by the increasingly violent seas, Chun lowered her binoculars and reported what they could both see plainly. The ship was listing at nearly 20 degrees now, far worse than the reports they had received an hour earlier. Several of the lower deck windows were already underwater, and the vessel's emergency lighting flickered sporadically as the electrical systems struggled to function. Most alarming of all, Elena could see people crowded on the upper decks, huddled together against the wind and spray without adequate protection from the elements. Elena adjusted the Resolute's approach vector, bringing them closer to the cruise ship's starboard side, where the list would provide some shelter from the worst of the wind. The smaller cutter rode the swells with an agility that the larger Vigilant could never have matched. But even so, the motion was violent enough to require both women to maintain constant grips on the bridge railings. The storm was arriving ahead of schedule, and the wave heights had already reached 18 feet with whitecaps streaming foam across their crests. Through the radio came the voice of Captain Rodriguez, the Meridian Star's master, his Spanish accent thick with exhaustion and barely controlled panic. His ship was taking on water faster than the manual pumps could handle, he reported, and the passenger evacuation was proceeding too slowly. Many of the elderly travelers were unable to climb to the upper decks without assistance, and several families had become separated in the chaos of the emergency. He needed immediate help, not just rescue coordination, but actual personnel to assist with the evacuation effort. Elena keyed her microphone and responded with the calm authority that had commanded respect in similar crises over the past 3 decades. She identified herself as the commander of the Coast Guard cutter approaching his position and requested a detailed manifest of passengers requiring immediate medical attention. Her voice carried clearly over the static and interference, and she could hear the relief in Rodriguez's response as he realized that professional help had finally arrived. The communication exchange that followed revealed the full scope of the emergency they were facing. 43 passengers were over the age of 70, including several who required regular medication that had been left in their flooded cabins. 18 families had children under the age of 12, and 3 pregnant women were among the passengers showing signs of hypothermia. The ship's medical facilities had been compromised by flooding, and the doctor aboard was working without proper equipment or adequate lighting. Chun worked frantically at the navigation station, plotting the Resolute's position relative to the cruise ship and calculating the optimal approach for a rescue operation. The mathematics were not encouraging. The Meridian Star was drifting toward the continental shelf at nearly 2 knots, pushed by currents that were intensifying as the storm surge built. Within 90 minutes, the ship would be in water too shallow for safe rescue operations, and the breaking waves over the shallows would make any evacuation attempt suicidal. Elena studied the tactical situation with the analytical precision that had made her legendary among her peers. The conventional approach would be to wait for the Vigilant and coordinate a systematic evacuation using multiple vessels and full rescue teams. But the deteriorating conditions and the ship's accelerating drift made conventional tactics inadequate. They needed to begin evacuating passengers immediately, starting with the most vulnerable, and they needed to do it with whatever resources were immediately available. She made the decision that would define the next several hours and possibly her entire career. Instead of maintaining a safe distance and calling for backup, Elena ordered Chun to prepare for immediate alongside operations. They would position the Resolute directly against the cruise ship's hull and begin transferring passengers using the smaller vessel's crane and rescue basket system. It was dangerous beyond the parameters of standard operating procedures, but it was also the only option that offered any hope of saving lives before the weather window closed completely. Chun's eyes widened as she realized what Elena was proposing. Positioning a 90-foot cutter alongside a drifting cruise ship in 18-foot seas violated every safety protocol in the manual. The risk of collision was enormous, and if the Resolute were damaged or disabled, both crews would be stranded in conditions that were rapidly becoming unsurvivable. The younger officer's training told her to object, but her experience working with Elena told her to trust the older woman's judgment. The approach required every skill Elena had developed over 30 years of challenging rescues. She had to anticipate the motion of both vessels, timing their relative positions to create brief moments when the Resolute could safely come alongside without being crushed against the cruise ship's hull. The calculation involved wind direction, wave patterns, current flow, and the specific handling characteristics of her vessel under extreme conditions. One miscalculation would destroy both ships and kill everyone aboard. Elena brought the Resolute in slowly, using short bursts of power to position the cutter in the trough between swells. The cruise ship towered above them, her hull plates streaked with rust and marine growth, rising and falling with a ponderous motion that could crush the smaller vessel like an eggshell. Through the spray and wind, Elena could see faces at the rail above, passengers and crew watching their approach with desperate hope mixed with terror. The first contact was gentle, almost delicate, as Elena judged the vessel's relative motion perfectly and allowed the Resolute's fenders to kiss the cruise ship's hull. But gentle contact became violent collision as the next swell lifted both ships and drove them together with tremendous force. The impact rang through the Resolute's steel structure like a bell, and Elena felt the wheel buck in her hands as the cutter's hull flexed under the strain. Chun had prepared the rescue equipment with professional efficiency, but nothing in her training had prepared her for the reality of operating in these conditions. The rescue basket swung wildly on its cable, buffeted by wind gusts that exceeded 40 knots, and the crane operator had to time each lift to coincide with the brief moments when the two vessels were in relative alignment. The margin for error was measured in inches and seconds, and any mistake would send the basket and its occupant into the churning water between the hulls. The first passenger to be transferred was an elderly woman who could barely walk, her face gray with cold and exhaustion. Elena watched from the bridge as the ship's crew helped her into the rescue basket, her frail form dwarfed by the safety harness and protective gear. The basket rose slowly from the cruise ship's deck, swaying sickeningly as it crossed the gap between vessels, and Elena held her breath until it touched down safely on the Resolute's stern deck. The process was repeated again and again, each transfer a small miracle of timing and skill. Children crying for their parents, elderly passengers who could barely stand, crew members who volunteered to help despite their own exhaustion. The Resolute's crew worked with desperate efficiency, knowing that every minute delayed was another step closer to disaster. The storm was intensifying steadily, and the wave heights were approaching the maximum safe operating limits for their equipment. Elena maintained position alongside the cruise ship through a combination of seamanship and sheer willpower, her hands never leaving the controls as she made constant adjustments to compensate for wind and wave action. The physical demands were enormous, requiring strength and endurance that many assumed she no longer possessed. But decades of experience had taught her to conserve energy where possible and apply it precisely where needed, and she found reserves of capability that surprised even her. Through the radio came regular updates from the Vigilant, still 40 minutes away and struggling to make progress against the deteriorating weather. Morrison's voice carried frustration and concern as he received reports of Elena's unconventional rescue operation. He ordered her to break off and wait for support, but Elena responded that breaking off would mean certain death for the passengers still awaiting evacuation. She would continue operations until the last possible moment, regardless of the risks to her own vessel and crew. The confrontation over the radio waves added another layer of complexity to an already impossible situation. Elena was operating outside the established chain of command, making tactical decisions that could result in court-martial proceedings if they went wrong. But she was also saving lives that would otherwise be lost, and every successful transfer validated her judgment against the caution of younger officers who had never faced comparable challenges. As the rescue operation continued, Elena began to notice changes in the behavior of both crews. The cruise ship's officers, initially skeptical of the small cutter's ability to help, now worked with desperate cooperation to prepare passengers for transfer. The Resolute's crew, many of whom had questioned Elena's capabilities in the past, now followed her orders with absolute trust and precision. Crisis had a way of stripping away pretense and revealing the essential competence that lay beneath. The most challenging transfer came when a family of 4, including 2 small children, needed to be evacuated together. The parents refused to be separated from their children, but the rescue basket could safely hold only 2 people at a time under the current conditions. Elena made the decision to attempt a double transfer, using both the basket and the emergency stretcher simultaneously, despite the increased risk of collision between the 2 pieces of equipment. Chun coordinated the complex operation from the stern deck, her voice calm and professional as she guided the crane operators through the delicate process. The parents went first, clutching each other in the basket as it swayed across the gap. Between vessels followed immediately by the children on the stretcher. For several terrifying seconds, both pieces of equipment hung suspended above the churning water, but skilled operation and careful timing brought them safely to the Resolute's deck. The success of the family transfer seemed to energize both crews, and the pace of the evacuation increased noticeably. Elena had managed to establish a rhythm that maximized safety, while maintaining the urgency required by the deteriorating conditions, but she was also aware that time was running out. The Meridian Star's list had increased to 25 degrees, and the ship was beginning to show signs of structural stress that suggested catastrophic failure might be imminent. Rodriguez's voice over the radio confirmed Elena's worst fears. The cruise ship's hull was beginning to buckle under the stress of the list and the pounding seas. Water was entering the vessel through new fractures that opened with each wave. Impact and the remaining pumps were losing the battle to keep the ship afloat. He estimated that they had perhaps 30 minutes before the vessel would be in immediate danger of capsizing. Elena absorbed this information without changing her expression or the steady rhythm of her commands. 30 minutes to evacuate nearly 100 passengers and crew members using equipment designed for single transfers under ideal conditions. The mathematics were impossible, but mathematics had never stopped her before. She had learned long ago that impossible missions became possible through a combination of skill, determination, and the willingness to accept risks that others would consider unacceptable. The Vigilant's arrival changed the dynamics of the rescue operation dramatically. The larger cutter approached with all the majesty of a warship, her powerful engines and heavy-duty equipment offering capabilities that the Resolute could never match. But Elena had already proven that size and equipment were less important than positioning and timing, and she had established a rescue operation that was functioning efficiently despite the challenging conditions. Morrison's voice over the radio was tight with barely controlled anger as he demanded that Elena break off her rescue operation and allow the Vigilant to take over. The proper procedures called for a coordinated approach using multiple vessels. He insisted, not the cowboy tactics that Elena was employing. Her response was calm but firm. She had passengers in the water and equipment deployed and braking. Off now would disrupt the rescue operation and potentially cost lives. The argument that followed was conducted over open radio channels, allowing everyone involved in the rescue operation to hear the conflict between the 2 commanders. Elena's crew listened with growing tension as their captain defended her tactical decisions against criticism from a superior officer. But they also continued to follow her orders with precision and dedication, trusting her judgment based on the results they could see with their own eyes. Elena's vindication came in the form of rescue statistics that spoke louder than any argument. In the 90 minutes since her arrival at the scene, she had successfully evacuated 67 passengers and crew members from the Meridian Star, including all of the most vulnerable individuals who had been identified as requiring immediate medical attention. The Resolute's deck was crowded with survivors wrapped in emergency blankets, their faces showing the exhaustion and relief of people who had been pulled back from the edge of disaster. The Vigilant positioned herself on the cruise ship's port side, using her greater size and stability to establish a more conventional rescue operation. But the larger vessel's draft and handling characteristics made it difficult to maintain the close positioning that Elena had achieved with the Resolute. The result was a slower, more cautious evacuation process that, while safer in theory, was less effective at moving large numbers of people quickly. Elena continued her operation on the starboard side, her smaller vessel darting in and out like a terrier worrying a much larger opponent. The contrast between the two approaches was stark and increasingly obvious to everyone involved. The Vigilance, by-the-book methods were professional and safe, but Elena's unconventional tactics were saving more lives per hour despite the greater apparent risk. The crisis point came when the Meridian Star's hull finally gave way under the accumulated stress of the storm and flooding. A section of the lower deck collapsed inward with a sound like breaking glass amplified through a megaphone, and the ship's list suddenly increased to 35 degrees. Passengers and crew on the upper decks screamed and clutched at railings as the vessel lurched sickeningly to starboard, and it became clear that capsizing was now a matter of minutes rather than hours. Elena reacted with the instantaneous decision-making that had defined her career. Instead of pulling away to a safe distance, she drove the Resolute closer to the cruise ship, positioning her vessel directly beneath the lowest point of the tilting deck. Passengers began jumping from the cruise ship to the cutter's deck, a desperate leap of 8 feet across churning water that required perfect timing and no small amount of courage. Chun organized the reception of the jumping passengers with remarkable efficiency, positioning crew members to catch and assist each person as they landed on the Resolute's deck. The operation was chaotic and dangerous, but it was also the only option available as the cruise ship's evacuation routes became unusable due to severe list. Within minutes, the Resolute's deck was packed with survivors who had made the terrifying leap to safety. Morrison's voice over the radio was sharp with alarm as he watched Elena's cutter disappearing beneath the shadow of the listing cruise ship. He ordered her to withdraw immediately, warning that she was putting her entire crew at risk for passengers who could be evacuated by other means. But Elena's response was calm and determined. There were no other means, she replied. The passenger she was rescuing would die if she withdrew, and that was not acceptable. The final moments of the rescue operation unfolded with dramatic intensity that tested everyone involved to their absolute limits. The Meridian Star continued to list further to starboard, her superstructure now hanging over the Resolute like a collapsing building. Elena had to use every ounce of her skill to maintain position without being crushed by the larger vessel, while simultaneously coordinating the evacuation of the remaining passengers who were now trapped on the high side of the tilting ship. The last passenger to be rescued was Captain Rodriguez himself, who had remained aboard his ship until every soul under his command had been evacuated. He made the jump from his bridge wing to the Resolute's deck with the desperate agility of a man who knew his ship was dying beneath his feet. As he landed safely on the cutter's deck, Elena immediately ordered full reverse, pulling her vessel away from the cruise ship just as the Meridian Star rolled past the point of no return. The cruise ship's final moments were both tragic and magnificent, a testament to the sea's power and the fragility of human engineering. The massive vessel rolled slowly onto her side, her superstructure disappearing beneath the waves with a sound like distant thunder. But instead of marking a disaster, the sight represented triumph. Every single passenger and crew member had been successfully evacuated, 197 souls saved from what had seemed like certain death. Elena stood on the Resolute's bridge, surrounded by survivors and crew members who looked at her with something approaching awe. She had accomplished what many had considered impossible, leading a rescue operation that violated every safety protocol, while achieving results that exceeded the most optimistic predictions. The older woman, who had been dismissed as past her prime, had just demonstrated why experience and judgment could not be replaced by youth and technology. Chung approached her captain with tears in her eyes, holding a final manifest that confirmed what everyone already knew. Every passenger and crew member from the Meridian Star was accounted for, either aboard the Resolute or the Vigilant. The rescue operation had been completed with 0 casualties, despite weather conditions that had pushed the boundaries of what was considered survivable for rescue operations. The radio crackled with voices from the Coast Guard Operations Center, news helicopters, and other vessels that had monitored the rescue operation. But Elena paid little attention to the chatter and congratulations. She was already focused on the next challenge, getting her overloaded vessel safely back to port through storm conditions that were continuing to intensify. The rescue was complete, but her responsibility for the lives aboard her ship would continue until every survivor was safely ashore. The return journey to port unfolded in a silence, broken only by the steady throb of the Resolute's engines and the occasional murmur of conversation among the survivors huddled on deck. Elena stood at the helm with the focused concentration of someone navigating through conditions that demanded absolute precision, her weathered hands steady on the wheel despite the exhaustion that threatened to overwhelm her. The cutter rode low in the water, carrying nearly 3 times her normal passenger capacity, and every wave that struck the bow sent spray cascading over the crowded deck where 197 people wrapped in emergency blankets bore witness to their salvation. The storm had reached its full intensity during the final stages of the rescue, transforming the Atlantic into a chaos of wind and water that tested the limits of both vessel and crew. 20-foot waves rolled beneath the Resolute's hull with the regularity of a malevolent heartbeat, each one lifting the overloaded cutter and then dropping her into the trough with a bone-jarring impact that Elena absorbed through her legs and spine. The wind howled through the rigging with a voice that spoke of nature's indifference to human ambition, and the spray that constantly swept the deck tasted of salt and the deep ocean's ancient fury. Shun moved among the survivors with the calm efficiency of someone who had learned to function under pressure, checking on the elderly passengers who showed signs of hypothermia and ensuring that the children remained close to their families. The young officer's uniform was soaked through and her face was pale with exhaustion, but her voice remained steady as she coordinated with the ship's medic to provide what care was possible under the challenging conditions. The rescue had been successful, but the responsibility for these lives would continue until every survivor was safely delivered to shore. Among the survivors, conversations began to emerge as the initial shock of their ordeal gave way to the gradual realization that they were safe. An elderly man from Chicago spoke in wondering tones about the skill of the female captain, who had brought her ship alongside the sinking cruise liner, describing maneuvers that had seemed impossible even as he watched them unfold. A young mother from Philadelphia clutched her 2 children and repeated over and over how the Coast Guard officer had personally helped them into the rescue basket, her voice breaking with emotion as she described the moment when she thought they might not survive. Rodriguez, the cruise ship's captain, stood near the bridge wing despite the driving spray, his eyes fixed on the horizon with the 1,000-yard stare of someone processing a trauma that would reshape his understanding of seamanship. He had commanded vessels for over 20 years, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for watching his ship die beneath his feet while simultaneously witnessing a rescue operation that redefined what was possible under extreme conditions. When he finally spoke, it was to ask Chun who the woman was who had saved his passengers and crew, his voice carrying a note of professional respect that transcended nationality and service rivalry. The radio traffic during the return journey provided a running commentary on the significance of what had just occurred. News helicopters circled at a respectful distance, their cameras capturing images of the overloaded cutter battling through heavy seas with her precious cargo of survivors. Coast Guard operations centers up and down the eastern seaboard monitored the Resolute's progress, ready to provide assistance if the weather conditions overwhelm the aging vessel's capabilities. But Elena's steady voice on the radio frequencies conveyed confidence and control, even as she navigated through some of the worst weather conditions of her career. The first indication that something had fundamentally changed came through a transmission from Admiral Patricia Hayes, the Coast Guard's Atlantic Area Commander, whose voice carried a gravity that cut through the static and interference. Hayes had been monitoring the rescue operation from her headquarters in Portsmouth, watching real-time feeds from reconnaissance aircraft and receiving detailed reports from multiple vessels in the area. Her message was brief but unprecedented, a direct communication from the service's highest levels to a field commander in the midst of operations. Admiral Hayes congratulated Elena on the successful completion of what she termed one of the most challenging rescue operations in recent Coast Guard history, noting that the innovative tactics and exceptional seamanship displayed during the evacuation had saved lives that would otherwise have been lost. But more significantly, the Admiral's message contained an element that Elena had not heard directed toward her in months. It was the tone of professional respect from a superior officer to someone whose capabilities had been demonstrated beyond any possible doubt. The transmission was heard by every vessel in the area, including the Vigilant where Morrison stood in his command center, listening to praise being directed toward the officer whose authority he had questioned throughout the operation. The younger captain's face showed the complex emotions of someone whose certainty about proper procedures had been challenged by results that exceeded anything achieved through conventional methods. His crew worked around him with the subdued efficiency of professionals, processing the realization that they had witnessed something extraordinary. As the main coast materialized through the storm and spray, Elena could see the harbor entrance that represented safety for the survivors crowded on her deck. The stone breakwater that protected the port stood firm against the attacking waves, its massive blocks worn smooth by countless storms, but still capable of providing shelter for vessels seeking refuge. The lighthouse at the harbor mouth swept its beam across the troubled waters with mechanical persistence, a beacon that promised landfall for those who had faced the ocean's worst and survived. But the approaching harbor also represented something more complex for Elena herself. The successful rescue operation had validated her decades of experience and demonstrated capabilities that had been dismissed by younger officers more concerned with procedure than results. Yet she was returning to a command structure that had already marginalized her, to superiors who would have to reconcile their assumptions about age and competence with the undeniable evidence of what she had accomplished. The harbor pilot who guided the Resolute through the entrance channel was a grizzled veteran named Murphy, who had worked these waters for 30 years, and his reaction to Elena's overloaded vessel provided the first indication of how the rescue would be received. Ashore, instead of the routine efficiency normally displayed during such operations, Murphy's voice carried notes of amazement and respect as he observed the condition of the survivors and the obvious stress that the Resolute had endured during the operation. He had seen many rescue vessels return from difficult operations, but nothing quite like this. The pier where the Resolute moored was lined with emergency vehicles and medical personnel prepared to receive the survivors, but it was also crowded with Coast Guard personnel, local officials, and media representatives who had gathered to witness the return of what news reports were already calling a miracle rescue. Elena had expected the emergency response, but the size and composition of the crowd suggested that word of the operation had spread far beyond normal Coast Guard channels. The process of transferring survivors from the cutter to shore unfolded with the careful precision of a medical operation. Each person evaluated by paramedics and either released to family members or transported to local hospitals for further treatment. Elena watched from the bridge as elderly passengers who had seemed near death just hours earlier walked down the gangway under their own power, supported by medical personnel but clearly recovering from their ordeal. The children who had been evacuated in the rescue baskets ran to waiting relatives with the resilience of youth, while their parents spoke in emotional interviews with reporters about the Coast Guard crew who had risked everything to save them. Rodriguez was among the last to leave the vessel, and before departing, he sought out Elena on the bridge where she was completing the post-operation log entries. The Spanish captain spoke English with careful precision, his words chosen to convey the depth of his professional gratitude. He had commanded passenger vessels for 2 decades, he told her, and had never witnessed seamanship of the caliber she had displayed during the rescue operation. Her willingness to risk her own vessel and crew to save his passengers represented the finest traditions of maritime service, and he would ensure that his company's official report reflected the extraordinary nature of her contribution. The debriefing that followed in the Coast Guard Operations Center was unlike any Elena had experienced in her 30-year career. The conference room was filled not only with local command personnel, but also with representatives from Coast Guard headquarters, maritime safety investigators, and senior officers who had flown in specifically to understand how the rescue operation had been accomplished. The questions came from multiple directions, focusing not on whether proper procedures had been followed, but on how Elena had achieved results that exceeded the most optimistic projections for the mission. Admiral Hayes participated in the debriefing via video conference, her presence adding weight to proceedings that were clearly being treated as more than routine operational analysis. The Admiral's questions focused on the tactical decisions that had enabled Elena to position her vessel so precisely alongside the sinking cruise ship, and her follow-up inquiries demonstrated a professional understanding of the challenges involved in such close quarters maneuvering under extreme weather conditions. Elena answered each question with the straightforward professionalism that had characterized her entire career, explaining her decisions in terms of immediate tactical requirements rather than dramatic personal choices. She had positioned the Resolute alongside the Meridian Star because it was the most effective way to evacuate passengers quickly under the existing conditions. She had continued the rescue operation despite orders to withdraw because breaking off would have resulted in preventable deaths. Her explanations were matter-of-fact and technical, focusing on seamanship and tactics rather than courage or heroism. But the officers conducting the debriefing understood that they were documenting something unprecedented. The rescue operation had succeeded not despite Elena's unconventional tactics, but because of them, and her ability to improvise effective solutions under extreme pressure had saved lives that would have been lost through rigid adherence to standard procedures. The questions gradually shifted from operational analysis to professional development, with senior officers seeking to understand how Elena's experience and judgment could be captured and transmitted to younger officers. The session was interrupted by a communications specialist who entered the conference room with a message that changed the entire atmosphere of the meeting. The White House had issued a statement praising the Coast Guard rescue operation and specifically mentioning Elena by name as an example of the service's dedication and professionalism. The President's statement noted that the successful evacuation of all passengers and crew from the Meridian Star represented the finest traditions of American maritime service and demonstrated the value of experience and expertise in crisis situations. Admiral Hayes's reaction to the presidential statement was immediate and decisive. She announced that Elena would be recommended for the Coast Guard's highest peacetime decoration, the Distinguished Service Medal, in recognition of her exceptional leadership during the rescue operation. More significantly, the Admiral indicated that Elena's tactical innovations during the mission would be incorporated into updated rescue protocols, ensuring that her experience would benefit future operations and save additional lives. The formal ceremonies that followed unfolded over several weeks, but their impact was immediate and transformative. Elena found herself called to Coast Guard headquarters in Washington, where she briefed senior officers on the tactical lessons learned during the Meridian Star rescue. Her presentations drew standing room-only audiences of officers eager to understand how unconventional thinking and experienced judgment had achieved results that traditional approaches could not match. The Distinguished Service Medal ceremony took place in the same operations center where Elena had been marginalized just weeks earlier, but the atmosphere was transformed by the presence of dignitaries and media representatives who had come to witness the recognition of exceptional service. Admiral Hayes personally presented the decoration, her remarks focusing on Elena's demonstration that age and experience represented valuable assets rather than liabilities in the modern Coast Guard. The medal itself was a simple bronze disc, suspended from a ribbon of Coast Guard colors, but its significance extended far beyond the physical award. Elena stood at attention as the citation was read, describing her exceptional leadership and innovative tactics during the rescue of 197 souls from imminent peril. The words were formal and official, but they represented a vindication of everything she had worked to achieve during her career in maritime service. Morrison was present for the ceremony, his face showing the complex emotions of someone whose professional judgment had been proven wrong by events beyond his control. When he approached Elena after the formal proceedings, his words were carefully chosen and professionally correct. He congratulated her on the recognition and acknowledged that her experience had proven invaluable during the rescue operation. The conversation was brief and somewhat strained, but it represented a form of closure for the conflict that had developed during the crisis. Shun, who had been promoted to lieutenant commander in part due to her performance during the rescue operation, spoke more openly about the lessons she had learned from working with Elena under extreme conditions. The younger officer described how watching Elena's decision-making process had changed her understanding of leadership and crisis management, noting that textbook solutions were often inadequate when confronted with real-world complexities that exceeded the parameters of training scenarios. The survivors of the Meridian Star became unexpected ambassadors for Elena's story, their testimonials providing compelling evidence of the impact that experienced leadership could have in life-or-death situations. Media interviews with passengers who had been evacuated by the Resolute consistently emphasized the professionalism and skill of the Coast Guard crew, with particular attention to the female captain whose unconventional tactics had made their rescue possible. Rodriguez submitted an official report to the International Maritime Organization that detailed Elena's rescue operation and recommended that her tactics be studied as a model for emergency response in extreme weather conditions. The Spanish captain's technical analysis of the operation concluded that Elena's ability to maintain precise positioning alongside a drifting vessel in heavy seas represented seamanship of the highest caliber, worthy of recognition throughout the international maritime community. The professional recognition that followed the rescue operation brought opportunities that Elena had not expected. She was invited to speak at maritime academies and professional conferences, sharing her experience with audiences of current and future officers who could benefit from her hard-won expertise. The speaking engagements took her across the country and internationally, spreading awareness of the tactical innovations that had made the Meridian Star rescue possible. More importantly, Elena was offered a position at the Coast Guard Academy as an instructor in advanced seamanship and crisis management, a role that would allow her to transmit her knowledge to the next generation of officers. The appointment represented not just professional recognition, but also an acknowledgement that her experience was valuable enough to be preserved and shared rather than simply retired when she reached mandatory retirement age. The new assignment brought Elena full circle in many ways, allowing her to remain active in the service while contributing to the development of younger officers who would face similar challenges in their own careers. Her classes quickly became some of the most popular at the academy, drawing students who were eager to learn from someone whose practical experience had been tested under the most demanding conditions. Elena's story began to appear in Coast Guard training materials and professional publications, serving as a case study in adaptive leadership and innovative tactics under extreme pressure. The rescue operation was analyzed in detail, with particular attention to the decision-making process that had enabled a single officer to achieve results that exceeded what larger, better-equipped vessels had been able to accomplish through conventional methods. The changes that followed the Meridian Star rescue extended throughout the Coast Guard's organizational culture, challenging assumptions about age, experience, and the value of unconventional thinking in crisis situations. Elena's success became a catalyst for broader discussions about how the service could better utilize the expertise of senior officers while still maintaining the energy and innovation that came with younger personnel. Admiral Hayes used Elena's story as an example during congressional testimony about Coast Guard capabilities and resource requirements, noting that the successful rescue operation had demonstrated the importance of maintaining experienced personnel in operational roles rather than automatically transitioning them to administrative positions based solely on age. The Admiral's testimony contributed to policy changes that provided greater flexibility in personnel assignments and career progression. The international recognition that Elena received included invitations to participate in maritime rescue, conferences and joint training exercises with allied nations, spreading awareness of American Coast Guard capabilities, while sharing tactical innovations that could benefit rescue operations worldwide. Her presentations to international audiences emphasized the universal nature of maritime challenges and the importance of experience-based knowledge in developing effective solutions. Elena's personal transformation was perhaps the most significant aspect of the entire experience. The officer who had been marginalized and dismissed found herself recognized as one of the Coast Guard's most valuable assets, sought after for her expertise and respected for her contributions to maritime safety. The confidence that had carried her through decades of successful operations was validated by official recognition and professional opportunities that exceeded anything she had imagined possible. The Resolute herself became something of a symbol, her battle-tested hull and equipment serving as a reminder that capability was not always measured by size or newness. The aging cutter continued in service with a crew that took pride in their vessel's role in one of the most successful rescue operations in recent memory, and Elena remained her commanding officer until her transfer to the Academy position. The survivors of the Meridian Star established an informal association that met annually to commemorate their rescue and maintain contact with the Coast Guard personnel who had saved their lives. Elena was invariably the guest of honor at these gatherings, surrounded by families whose gratitude served as a permanent reminder of why her service mattered and why experience remained irreplaceable in situations where lives hung in the balance. Rodriguez returned to sea as captain of a new cruise ship, but he carried with him lessons learned from his encounter with Elena's professionalism and expertise. His subsequent safety protocols and emergency procedures reflected insights gained from watching someone operate at the absolute pinnacle of maritime competence, and he became an advocate for greater recognition of the skills that came only through decades of experience in challenging conditions. The legacy of the Meridian Star rescue extended far beyond the immediate recognition and career changes that followed the operation. Elena's tactical innovations were incorporated into Coast Guard doctrine, ensuring that future rescue operations would benefit from the lessons learned during those desperate hours in the North Atlantic. Her story became part of the service's institutional memory, a reminder that excellence could emerge from unexpected sources and that age brought wisdom that could not be replicated through training alone. Years later, Elena would look back on the rescue operation as the defining moment of her career, not because it brought recognition or advancement, but because it demonstrated that her life's work had value that extended beyond personal achievement. The 197 souls who returned safely to their families represented the ultimate validation of everything she had learned and practiced during her decades of service to maritime safety. The quiet confidence that had sustained Elena through years of dismissal and marginalization was finally matched by the professional recognition she had earned through exceptional performance under the most demanding conditions imaginable. She had proven that experience, judgment, and the willingness to accept calculated risks could achieve results that rigid adherence to procedure could not match, and her legacy would continue to influence maritime rescue operations for generations to come. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.